Welcome to Zestful Aging, where I interview inspiring and fascinating women who talk about their projects as well as their own lives as evolving women. I'm your host, Nicole Christina. And if you like the podcast, you'll love my newly updated companion online course, Zestful Aging, Simple and Sustainable Habits for Health and Longevity. Learn more at NicoleChristina.com. Well, I have my coffee in my hand and my little Jack Russell Sparky right beside me. So let's begin. Hello, today we have Adela Mizrachi, who is the founder of the Podcast Brunch Club, which is described to be like a book club, but for podcasts. And there is a global community out there that's involved in the club. There are 30 chapters, and they're on 4 continents. Adela also flips houses. She's a busy woman, and she works at Northwestern University in the communications department. Welcome, Adela.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Thanks for joining. We have a lot of material to cover because you come at this with so many different skills and talents and adventures. But let's just start with the Podcast Brunch Club. Would you tell me a little bit about how you got interested in podcasts, just for you individually? How did you get hooked?
You know, I think it's hard to remember, but somebody just recommended it. I happened to be going on vacation. It was one of those, beach vacations where you don't do anything. And those are not usually the types of vacations I take because I'm usually pretty active and I like to explore and do things. But this was one where I was like, I'm going to be sitting on a beach chair for extended periods of time. I'm going to need to keep my mind occupied. And sometimes just reading in the sun gives me headaches. So I thought I'd download a bunch of podcasts and give it a try. And within a day, I was hooked. I even figured out a way I had a Bluetooth headset. It was back in like 2014, I think, 2013. And I figured out a way to put a little receiver thing in my bun so that I could actually be in the pool listening to my podcast while I was in the pool because I could not take a break.
Wow. Mm-hmm. That's a great visual right there. Do you remember what the first podcasts were? Yeah, you do. Which one?
Oh yeah. Radiolab. It was 100% Radiolab. Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's so fascinating.
Yeah.
And are there particular sort of elements that you see that there's a pattern? Are there elements to podcasts that you really gravitate towards?
Yes, for sure. I think for me, I always want to feel like I'm enriching myself in some way. I'm educating myself in some way. Even if it's not, not that entertainment is not a value I have. I definitely want to be entertained while I'm being educated, but I want to feel kind of like I'm being enriched, whether that's through a story that somebody's telling about their personal life or some academic researcher kind of walking us through their research. So those are the types I gravitate toward. I personally don't. I know there's a huge pull right now for true crime podcasts. That doesn't really do it for me. And I know there's a lot of audio drama out there. Also, it's not something that I gravitate towards. I tend to do more thoughtful things that make me think. Things that make me want to talk to people about it.
And they're a little quirky. Radiolab has a little quirky element to it.
Yeah, I love the quirky ones. Those are fun. Heavyweight's another great one that just recently came out. That's just a little fun to listen to.
Do you remember the moment when you were listening to podcasts, taking them with you wherever you went, and you had the thought, this is really worth sharing. I want to take this to the next step. Do you remember that?
I 100% do. It actually was at a very kind of trying time in my life. I had a back surgery, and it was my second within a 13-month period. And the first one was like no problem. The second one just completely wrecked me. And I just went to a really bad place in my head. I've never experienced depression really until that moment. And now I have a new appreciation for people who suffer from it regularly. But mine was sort of acute, I guess. And I needed to find ways to occupy my mind that didn't sort of force me to reflect inward. Books, I could just easily get distracted by reading. Movies were not doing it for me. And I was just listening to so many podcasts. And then a group of friends all came over, bring me dinner and just chat and keep me company for one evening. And one friend and I just went down that rabbit hole. Somehow we got on the topic of podcasts, probably because I started a sentence with, "Oh my gosh, I was listening to this podcast and I learned, whatever, fill in the blank." And she just came back with, "Oh my God, I heard that podcast too. Did you hear this one?" And I was like, "No, what's that one? I'm going to download it right now." And it just
I can imagine you're looking it up as she's talking.
Oh yeah, we were both on our phones downloading podcasts. And that was the moment. I mean, I just realized, oh yeah, this needs to be a thing that happens regularly. And this is exactly why book clubs exist, because book reading is a very solitary activity, just like podcast listening. And that, maybe max you're listening with one other person if you're listening in the car. But, most of the time people got their headphones in. And, we want to talk about it. This is all really interesting stuff. And for me, I'm just always going places, doing things. I'm always moving. So reading books was just off the table for me. And so, I could be driving and listening to a podcast, or walking somewhere and listening to a podcast. I can't be walking somewhere and reading a book,
That's a little dangerous.
Yeah. That'd be very scary. So,
had you been in book clubs before?
I had been, and then I actually had a bunch of friends, the same group of girlfriends that came over that night, who had their own book club, and they kept asking me to join, and I was like, nope, I'm not going to do it, because I know myself. I cannot find, for whatever reason, reading wasn't, I don't know, I couldn't concentrate on it. I couldn't live in it the same way that I can live in a podcast, that I can kind of zone everything else out, and all the chatter going on in my head of all the things I should be doing. I just can't zone that out when I'm reading for some reason. I also think I'm a very, very, very slow reader. And so that just frustrates me, because I'm like, I want to get through this content faster so I can get more content. And I'm just a slow reader. And so I resisted, even though they were all my friends, and a lot of them were like, you don't have to even read the book. I just was like, I would just feel bad. And then I'd feel stressed, and then I'd feel guilty for not reading the book. And, that's a whole thing that I just
who needs that when you're already feeling low?
Yeah. Yeah. So, so that was the moment. It was an aha moment, and I realized, and actually it's funny too, because I do remember at the time I was listening to a podcast called Startup from Gimlet Media, and it's Startup is very meta in and of itself, because it's hosted by Alex Bloomberg, who used to be part of This American Life. He worked with Ira Glass, and he just Yeah. So he decided to start his own company called Gimlet Media, and Startup was the first podcast from Gimlet Media, and it was basically chronicling his startup of his podcasting company. So it was very meta. And so as I was listening to that, there was a moment, I think, in one of the episodes that said something, brought up the point that podcast listening is very lonely. And, and it's a lonely, I think actually podcast creating can also be lonely, but podcast listening, it's not lonely. It's solitary. And so it was like those two things happened right around the same time. And I just wanted to make this a thing. And the friend and I talked about it. And she said, I have some friends I can invite. And I said, great, I'll have some friends I can invite. And so we started in Chicago, just meeting for brunch. That's why we called it Podcast Brunch Club. And very quickly we realized we needed to have a theme every month rather than just picking 3 random podcast episodes that had nothing to do with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then I opened it up to the world, like maybe about a year into doing it with Chicago. And yeah, now we have actually over 30 chapters on 5 continents now. We just added a chapter in New Zealand.
Wow. There's so many follow-up questions I want to ask you, but I'm thinking about, and I'm sure people have analyzed this and thought about this really thoroughly, but some people would be sitting in front of the TV. Even people like you who sound very curious and intellectually, hungry, they could sit in front of public TV.
Sure.
But this is different. It's a different experience. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think about this a lot because my fiance is a TV watcher and it drives me completely crazy. Mm-hmm. But I also think that there's an element of podcast listening that because it's something that you can multitask, you don't feel like you're wasting time. So with TV, I just feel like I'm wasting time. I'm not doing the dishes. I'm not, running my errands. I'm not doing the laundry, or I'm not, going to the next house to flip or whatever, or flipping the house, doing some of the work in the house. If I was watching TV, I wouldn't be doing any of those other things. But while I'm listening to podcasts, I can do all of those other things. And so it feels a little bit more productive to me.
I read something where the average podcast lasts about the same amount of time as the average commute, so that people are, using that obviously in their cars and multitasking. Yeah. I have to tell you, have you ever seen Ira Glass do a presentation?
No.
I had the real fortune. He came to Syracuse University, and I think you'll really appreciate this. He started it in the pitch black. So he's talking because it's really all about his voice and your imagination. So he wanted to sort of replicate this feel of, the podcast, and it was so dramatic. And wow!
You mean he started the presentation in the pitch black?
Yes, he was on the stage, pitch black, and he started his talk. And they had, in the gift shop, they had T-shirts that said, Ira Glass is a rock star. And I thought, sounds like he might be your kind of rock star.
Yeah. He's great.
He's brilliant.
Yeah. And actually, Alex Bloomberg, who's the man I was talking about who started Gimlet and was, I guess, worked with Ira Glass for a very long time. He did the keynote speech at Podcast Movement when it was in Chicago, which is where I live, and I happened to go. And I listened, I listened to his keynote speech, and it was incredible. He basically, and I forget the statistics that he brought up, but he was exploring kind of why is audio so much more compelling than reading and then watching, audio visual kind of content. And his hypothesis is that it requires, and this is not, let's just compare audio visual to audio only. Like his hypothesis was that, you are required to sort of use your own imagination in audio only. And by using your own imagination, you're sort of invested more in the story and in the content. Whereas audio visual, like everything is just being done for you, and it's a much more passive experience.
There's an intimacy.
Yes.
That you're describing. I would be so curious to have brains in the PET scan, one when they're doing just podcasts, and I'm guessing it's been done, and one where somebody's maybe taking in content on YouTube or Facebook or something.
Right.
It'd be really interesting to see the regions that are lighting up, and that's my geeky self kind of sneaking
No,
out
I love that. I'm with you on that. And like, I think that it's true for readers too, right? You're invested because you're sort of inserting your own imagination into the stories by envisioning the people that you're reading about or whatever. But I do believe that there are different people out there, people who are, visual, people who are auditory, and then people who might, take in information through reading. And so, podcast is just another way to get content. I have a friend who cannot listen to podcasts. She's just like, I can't do it. As soon as I have headphones in my ears and I'm doing something else, I'm focused on what I'm doing. I'm not focused on what's in my ears.
So talk a little bit about the experience of being with your brunch clubbers. And so you'll pick a restaurant, or how does this work? What are the logistics?
Yeah. So, I mean, every chapter sort of operates in their own way. And whenever somebody approaches me to start a chapter, and any of your listeners are welcome to approach me as well. I always just say, really the primary thing is that it's easy on the chapter leader. Whatever method you choose for organizing your group, just make it easy on yourself, because this is something you're doing for fun and it shouldn't be a huge burden. So for me, I just send out an Evite every month, and we always pick the last Sunday of the month, and I sort of pick a different restaurant, and we just kind of hop around the city and experience different brunch places. We're getting to a point now that we're getting big enough that I think we might have to just kind of make a relationship with a restaurant or some sort of venue where they just host us. They know we're coming. They're very flexible. They'll bill each person separately, that kind of thing. Just a logistical arrangement. And then also, if we just had a brunch club on Sunday, and it was amazing. We had 14 people RSVP. I think 12 showed up, and the restaurant, the way that it ended up working out is they put us at two separate tables, completely separate tables on the same floor, but they were 6 and 6, and we're at round tables. And so it was perfect. It was a great, rather than having 12 people at a big long table, 6 and 6 at a round table worked really, really well. And actually Helene, who is the way, you found out about me through Next Act for Women, and Helene was at that brunch. And of course, I asked her to be at the other table than I was, so that she could sort of facilitate that. She's a great facilitator. So
yes. Have you thought, and I'm sure you have, but have you thought about like doing some kind of, at people's homes, like a traveling brunch club, or does that sound like too much work?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that. So that's actually, oddly enough, the way our New York City chapter is doing it. They have one chapter member who's always happy to host at her place, and it's a potluck, and everybody just brings food. And they had 25 people show up Sunday. Wow. Yes, I know. And I just reached out to the chapter leader saying, okay, is this, do you want to work through some, think through some ideas for making it easier? She said, well, for now it's still okay. But, there's also the apartment building has like a venue, sort of party room that they could use too. And so that is definitely an idea. I think because a lot of our chapters, I always give people who approach me about starting a chapter the option. You can either have a private chapter where it's just you and your network, and then I don't put it on the website, or you can have, a public facing chapter where it's open to anybody who wants to join. I would say 99% of the people who approach me want to start open chapters. So in that way, I can see why some people would be a little apprehensive to maybe go to somebody's house if they're a new person joining the group, or even inviting strangers into your own home. I'm shocked it's happening in New York City, to be honest. I thought anywhere in the world that's going to happen is not going to be New York City, but I was wrong.
Right. So you've discovered through some pretty intense adversity the way to put something together that you love and you enjoy, and do something that is like on the top 3 of health promoting behaviors, which is being in community. were you aware of that? Or maybe at some kind of intuitive level, like, this is really healthy?
I don't think I gave that aspect of it any thought, honestly. I just think I was like, I want this, so I'm going to create it. And if I want this and I can create it in Chicago, I'm sure other people in other cities want this and I can help them create it wherever they live. And it was just a very kind of rudimentary thought process. I really didn't, I think part of the beauty of what happened with Podcast Brunch Club is that I just kind of let it evolve into what it evolved into without trying to strong arm it into anything that I imagined.
Mm-hmm.
When I thought about putting it out into the world, I really thought most people were going to want to do private Podcast Brunch Club groups with their friends, and that it would be a really simple, and it wouldn't be super, I never thought of it as sort of like a global community when I envisioned inviting other people in other cities to join. Mm-hmm. I really thought it was just going to be, groups of friends in different cities, and that would be the extent of it. But it turned into what it turned into, and I couldn't be happier.
I can imagine. It's just a great solution to a lot of different, problems. You talked a bit about being a curious woman and that you just love learning new things. Tell me about Ethiopia and how those things may be related.
Yeah. Well, so I want to just go back one thing. I want to tell you a funny little anecdote about the community thing. And I just right before I got on the phone call with you, I just emailed our London chapter leader who had reached out to me saying, hey, I'm going to be in the Portland, Seattle area. Do we have any chapters there? Mm-hmm. And she wanted to, join them, which is a great way to meet people while you're traveling. Unfortunately, we don't. Actually, the West Coast is underrepresented in a Podcast Brunch Club, but I happen to have a friend out in Seattle, and so I'm linking them up. So for me, it really is about kind of creating connection between people, even if it's not between me and that person, because I've actually never met our London chapter leader. But if I can create connections for people, that just, I don't know, it just makes me feel really great.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And, then there's that unintended health benefit that you were talking about. I feel good about what I'm doing, and that just makes me smile, and smiling is healthy.
And you're hitting another one without maybe even recognizing it, that this idea, the term is kind of cumbersome, generativity, the idea of giving, sort of what we think of paying forward, or giving of ourselves in a way that you're not necessarily going to have a benefit from, but it's right. the same stuff that makes volunteering so satisfying. And it sounds like that's what you're doing. It's like, this is going to be great.
Yeah.
London's going to meet Seattle, and I'll hear good stuff. But there's no direct benefit to you, only that you're making people feel good and contributing.
Yeah. Yeah, because to be honest, like I've said this before too, there's so much, if you watch the, nightly news, it's just like depressing.
If you can.
News. Yeah. Right. Depressing news after depressing news after depressing news. And it just seems like sometimes I read these articles about what's happening in the world, and I just think that, sometimes I just get overwhelmed by what I see as sometimes pure evil that exists in this world. And then I always have to kind of take a step back, and Podcast Brunch Club is like my sort of, I can do my trust fall for Podcast Brunch Club, because I know that there's actually so many more people in the world that are good, decent human beings than bad. And sometimes it's hard to see that when you're just focused on the news and what's going on in the world, because
absolutely. Yeah.
And so Podcast Brunch Club is I just have met so many awesome, giving, thoughtful people through it, that it just has sort of given me a new perspective on who is out there in the world.
Wow. I mean, this idea of creating this entity that sort of spreads goodness and spreads joy and is growing. Yeah. It must be so satisfying.
Yeah. And the other part about it that we didn't really touch on is that it's creating dialogue. we're talking to each other. We're putting our phones and our tablets away for a 2-hour brunch or happy hour or whatever, however each city does it. And we're actually like looking each other face to face and talking about things that sometimes are a little hard to talk about. Like we talked about love last month, or this month, February, but and next month we're talking about adoption. And we've talked about fear, and we've talked about laughter, and we've talked about all sorts, prison, and you're talking about these topics that are kind of heavy sometimes with people that maybe you've never met before. So that's the other part of it that also feels really, really good, is that you're just talking to people. You're coming from the same starting point because you've all listened to the same podcasts, and each conversation might go in a very different direction, and that's fine. That's fine. That's what this is about. It's just having a conversation with another human being, about a topic that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise talked to them about.
And that is very different than watching TV. PBS, is probably the exception. But many people experience that as being kind of a numbing, from stress, from anxiety, from their workday, that they'll just go there and they can kind of check out mentally, just like it's pre-digested, entertain me. The same with Facebook. This is very different. You're describing being fully engaged and thoughtful and interactive. It's a completely you're describing this as a completely different experience.
Yeah. And there's not to say that there isn't room in everybody's life for a little bit of checking out and, just letting entertainment, take over. There's definitely room. It seems like there's 1,000 ways to do that and not as many ways to kind of create that real, true dialogue and engagement among people in your near vicinity. And there's plenty of networking events and there's plenty of different groups you can join. The nice thing about Podcast Brunch Club is, like, again, you're starting from the same starting point every month. You're coming in having listened to the exact same podcast, and everybody's going to have a different perspective about it. But it's not, networking events are great, but it always feels like, oh, what can you do for me? Or what can I do for you? And people, it's a little transactional.
There's an agenda. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's an agenda. Do people come with notes to these meetings?
Sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if relationships are fostered and enhanced.
I know friendships for sure. And I was just saying the other day with my Podcast Brunch Club group, because our topic was love, I said, my dream is to find out that that one of the Podcast Brunch Club meetings created a romantic relationship. That would be great. And, that's just, again, it's like, that's not the intention, but and that sort of is why I think people feel comfortable coming, because it's not, you're putting yourself out there, but you're not putting yourself out there in a completely vulnerable way. You're just coming. And again, you've all listened to the same thing, and you're coming there to talk about that thing. And if the conversation veers towards something completely different, that's totally fine. There's never an agenda, even if it's off the topic, even if it's off podcasts, whatever it is, it goes where it goes.
2 hours. You can sit through and say, well, I didn't like that particular subject.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, but sorry, I feel like I took us off on another tangent.
No, I am curious about Ethiopia and how this fits into, you sound very, there's this volunteer aspect, there's a greater good aspect, and you wanting to contribute. I'm just curious how you ended up living in Ethiopia.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm from Chicago. I graduated during sort of the dot-com boom, and I got snatched up, and I ended up in Washington, D.C. somehow, sort of like totally unintentionally, and not really in a job or a field that I feel like I was meant to be in. And I happened to be living in D.C. when September 11th happened, and I could see the smoke coming off the Pentagon, and I had been dating somebody that actually worked at the Pentagon every day. He was fine, but it was just
close to home.
Yeah, and it was just an amazing thing to witness, to see, for anybody, whether you were in the city that was affected or not, just, and even afterward, just to see the a little bit of the extreme patriotism that I saw was a little scary, to be honest. I'm Jewish. Well educated about the Holocaust and sort of the extreme patriotism that was, sort of preceded a lot of what happened. And I actually happened to have a friend from Germany coming to visit me a couple of months later. I think she came around in December, January, and she saw all of the American flags flying and freaked out because she said, like, oh my God, no, in Germany, it's almost like neo-Nazi to fly the American flag. And I was surprised by her reaction, but thinking about it and seeing some of the freedom fries and all the things and sort of like and a lot of this stuff is obviously still happening, and with, racial profiling and just kind of whatever, everybody's anybody who's a certain color is a terrorist and this and that. And I just it was hard for me to witness. And I had studied abroad, and I really, really wanted to get into kind of getting young people out of America. That was sort of my goal. I was like, we need to get these kids out of here. We need to get them experiencing other things. They need to see what it's like, meet people from different places that speak different languages, that have different, but while they're young, because they're still a little bit malleable. And I decided I really didn't know what I was doing. I just went to a graduate fair, and I talked to somebody about it. I thought it was going to be international relations or something, and I realized that there's actually an international education degree. And I ended up deciding to go and get my international education master's degree from George Washington University, and then graduated. And I ended up working, instead of working in the study abroad kind of field, I ended up going into international development. DCA being DC, there's a lot of foreign aid money. There's a lot of government contracting in general. And so there's tons of nonprofits and organizations that are doing education, health, democracy, agriculture work in developing countries, using money from the U.S. Agency for International Development or other funders. And I was hired by one of these companies and started working with them. And that's how I ended up in Ethiopia. This is sort of a funny story. It was about 5 years into me working there. I never really intended to. I traveled a lot while I worked there. But I never really was one of those people who wanted to be an expat. And there were plenty of young people who just wanted to, live the glamorous life of an expat and wanted to find any way to do that. I was not that person. I liked I had traveled a lot already. I just didn't want to be an expat. I don't even know if I ever gave any thought as to why, but I was placed on the Ethiopia project that we won. It was going to train. We ended up training 20,000 English language teachers in Ethiopia. And I was really supposed to be the home office project manager. So I was going to stay in DC and do sort of the back end home office work for the project. And we were going to have a country director living in the country. But the way that it works out with almost every single U.S. government contract that anybody ever gets, it's always late. And so the person that we were supposed to hire to be the country director couldn't wait around for that job to just, magically appear. And she got another job. And so all of a sudden, like the next day, we finally got the contract from the client, and we didn't have anybody to go.
Oh my goodness.
And I was supposed to go with her for 3 weeks to help start the project. And it really is like starting a company in another country. So I ended up going with another person who was a senior person. And then after, a week and a half of being there, they said, hey, would you be willing to stay for a year and be the country director?
Oh my goodness.
And funny enough, and I think your audience might appreciate this, the older woman that I was with, I really just kind of was on the fence. I had a relationship at home, but I was sort of on the fritz anyway. I had friends. I didn't pack my things. Like I had a condo, like it was a whole thing.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. And I was, hemming and hawing, and Mona was asking me about it. And when she realized I was sort of on the fence, she looked at me, and I will never forget. She goes, Adela, when a door opens, you walk through it. Do not ask questions about whether you should walk through it. Just walk through it.
That was a big door, though.
It was a big door, but it just sort of was like, yeah, that's true. When an opportunity presents itself, and it's scary but exciting, and just do it. And
I love your DIY spirit. You just, it seems like, you figure out what's important to you, and then somehow you make it into something incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it was an experience. I would not say, I loved the year I was there. I won't lie, but they asked me to stay another 2 years. I think that project got extended for 2 years, and I just drew my line in the sand, and I said no. Mm-hmm. I felt like I had done it. I had, and there's a whole reason I can go into if you want of why, and what I sort of realized while I was there about that lifestyle. But I just sort of decided it wasn't for me. Mm-hmm. And I think the longer...
Maybe this is a funny question, but it's a question that I've asked other guests, and I think it can be thought-provoking. Do you have a system where you ask yourself, is this right for me? Is this the right door? How do I know if I should step ahead? Because you have been presented opportunities. You've done a lot of different things, with Podcast Brunch Club, with flipping houses, with, your advanced degree. What is it that helps you decide whether or not to invest yourself in a project?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I wouldn't say I have a system in that my system is not having a system. So I learned very early on in my career that, and I guess in my adult life, in the beginning of my adult life, that if you try to wrangle something, if you have this, like your sights set on something, and you're just like going after it, like, full force and steamrolling your way.
Yeah.
For me in my life, it's always backfired every time I've done it that way. And not in a way that was super negative or anything. Most of the time it had unintended beneficial consequences, but the thing that I was going after actually never happened or somehow blew up in my face. And it was just like sort of devastating at the time. And, you roll with the punches, and then you realize, okay, maybe that was for the best in the end, or who knows, maybe it wasn't for the best, but you'll never know. Fine, whatever, move on. But I realized after a couple of experiences kind of like that, okay, just like let things happen. Let things work out, and don't try to strong arm everything. And things usually work out really well. And I think that happens to be true in my case. I don't know that I could speak for everybody, but I think what it has done for me is that it has kept me open to anything and everything. Whereas had I had my sights set on something, I think I would have been walking around with blinders on and not seen the forest for the trees, and wouldn't have known those opportunities when they presented themselves because I wasn't looking for them.
That's really thought-provoking. Is that the kind of advice you think your younger self would have given to yourself now, is being flexible and not trying to strong arm your goals into submission?
Yes, absolutely. That's what I would tell any young person I was talking to right now. Any person of any age, honestly, is what, and again, like it's one, and it equals one in this experiment. It's me and my experience, and I can learn from my experience, and I can hope other people might learn from my experience, but they have to learn for themselves and do what works for them. But yeah, for me, it's always been, and the thing about me though, that I think might not be true of everybody, is that I have I don't have a singular focus of what I'm interested in. And I think that's true of a lot of people, but it's also not true of a lot of people. Like, I could never, ever imagine getting my PhD. That would be like 4 to 6 years of my life to me to seem wasted on one thing, you know, on
hyper focus.
Yeah. For me, I need that variety. I love that variety. And so I thrive on the different things I'm doing. And if I was only doing Podcast Brunch Club and I wasn't doing flipping, or if I was only doing flipping and I wasn't doing Podcast Brunch Club, I think I would be like, I'd feel boxed in. And I need that variety because I've always described myself as a jack of all trades, master of none. But also always trying to master something, but like really never really giving
not
it a
holding
shot.
It too tightly in your fists. So you have developed this thriving, unique community, which originally grew out of a pretty dark place.
Yeah, it did. I
love your spirit.
Yeah, I know. It's funny to think about it when you like look at it in retrospect. You know, sometimes some going through some dark things can actually bring about some beautiful things.
I think that is often the way it happens. In my experience seeing clients, you know, that whole thing about crisis is also opportunity. Yeah. It doesn't feel good when you're there, but new things tend to sprout out. You need the whole system has to kind of, the tectonic plates or whatever have to shift in a big way. Yeah. I love your spirit of openness and adventure and curiosity. It has been such a pleasure getting to know your story and hear about you. And I'm going to put the link to Podcast Brunch Club in the notes.
Great.
And so I think my listeners will be interested in hearing more.
Yeah. Well, anybody is welcome to join us or start a chapter. The information is on the website.
Okay. Thank you so much, Adela, for joining me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much for joining us on Zestful Aging. If you like the podcast, please share with some of your friends. I love to hear from my listeners. Send me an email at NicoleChristina.com. And please consider becoming a patron of the show. You will get access to exclusive bonuses, and you will be part of the Zestful Aging community. Keep us going strong. Go to patreon.com/zestfulaging. See you next time for another episode of Zestful Aging.